In the soft, rolling foothills of Virginia's Piedmont region, where the Blue Ridge Mountains paint a hazy line against the western sky, a young boy named James Madison spent his earliest years. The estate of Montpelier, then a more modest plantation known as Mount Pleasant, was not just his home, but his entire world, a vast classroom of nature, society, and quiet contemplation. Born in 1751, the eldest of 12 children, James was a small and somewhat delicate child, not drawn to the rough physical labors of the frontier. Instead, his world was one of books, observation, and the intricate social web of a colonial gentry family. His father, James Madison Sr., was a leading planter and justice of the peace, a man of substance whose brick mansion spoke of stability and order. From him, young James absorbed lessons in civic duty and land stewardship. His mother, Nellie Conway Madison, provided a nurturing anchor, managing a bustling household that was a microcosm of 18th-century Virginia life, filled with siblings, relatives, and the constant, unspoken presence of the enslaved community upon whose labor everything depended. The landscape itself was a gentle tutor. The woods of oak and hickory, the clear streams, and the cultivated fields of tobacco and wheat formed a rhythmic backdrop to his days. He would have learned to ride, to survey the boundaries of the vast property, and to understand the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest. Yet, one senses a certain solitude in the boy, a preference for the library his father cultivated over the hunting field. It was here, among the volumes shipped from London, that he first encountered the wider world of ideas. The quiet of the Virginia countryside was not empty. It was filled with the sounds of insects, distant work songs from the fields, and the rustle of pages turning. This tranquility allowed for deep thought, fostering a mind that would one day grapple with the loudest questions of governance and human liberty. His formal education began at a small school on the plantation, run by a Scottish tutor. Here, he mastered the classics and the rigors of Latin and Greek. But the most profound education was unspoken, woven into the very fabric of Montpelier. As a child of the plantation gentry, he was raised within the profound contradiction that would define his nation and his own life, a deep-seated belief in personal liberty, existing alongside the brutal system of chattel slavery. The enslaved men, women, and children at Montpelier, numbering over 100, built the house, planted the crops, cooked the meals, and tended to the family's every need. Young James interacted with this system daily, a reality as commonplace as the sunrise, yet one that would later clash violently with the principles he so eloquently defended. At the age of 11, his world expanded. He was sent to study under the renowned Donald Robertson in King and Queen County, a journey away from the familiar comforts of home. Robertson's school was known for its rigorous curriculum in mathematics, geography, and modern languages. For 5 years, Madison immersed himself in this scholarly environment, his intellect flowering far from the pastoral routines of Montpelier. His letters home revealed a studious, serious young man, meticulous in his pursuits. This period solidified his identity as a scholar, not a soldier or a mere planter's son. He returned to Virginia at 16, but home had changed, or perhaps he had. The provincial education was no longer enough for his hungry mind. For the next 2 years, his father engaged a private tutor, the Reverend Thomas Martin, to continue James's studies at Montpelier. Reverend Martin, a recent graduate of the College of New Jersey at Princeton, opened a new window. He spoke not of the Anglican traditions of Virginia's William and Mary, but of the Enlightenment thinkers, the Presbyterian intellectual fervor, and the radical ideas of liberty brewing in the northern colonies. Under Martin's guidance, Madison's focus shifted from the classics of the past to the pressing philosophies of his own century, the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and Hume. The quiet halls of Montpelier thus became the cradle for revolutionary thought, the verdant grounds nurturing a mind that would help invent a republic. This unique childhood, rooted in land, shaped by books, and framed by societal paradox, forged the essential James Madison. The calm, methodical, and deeply principled man he became can be traced to these early years of observation and study. He learned the value of stability from his father's well-ordered estate. He learned the power of ideas from his father's library and his tutors. And he lived, daily, with the complex realities of power, dependence, and human bondage. As he prepared to leave Montpelier for the collegiate halls of Princeton, he carried with him not the brash confidence of a natural aristocrat, but the quiet, determined resolve of a thinker who had already learned to look deeply at the world around him, questioning its foundations from within the safety of his Virginia home. In the autumn of 1769, a slight, unassuming 18-year-old from Virginia arrived at the College of New Jersey, nestled in the small village of Princeton. Unlike many of his Southern peers who attended the Anglican William and Mary, James Madison was drawn north by the college's Presbyterian ethos and its fiery president, John Witherspoon. Witherspoon, a recent import from Scotland, was a dynamo of the Enlightenment, determined to turn the college into a forge for revolutionary minds. For Madison, the journey was a conscious break from the predictable path of a Virginia gentleman. He was in search of an education in liberty, not just in letters. The campus, with its grand Nassau Hall, then one of the largest stone buildings in the colonies, must have seemed a world away from the sprawling, horizontal life of Montpelier. Here, the world was vertical, intellectual, and intensely focused within gray stone walls. Driven by an almost compulsive thirst for knowledge, Madison embarked on a grueling schedule. Unhappy with the standard pace, he petitioned to take 2 years' worth of classes concurrently. He adopted a punishing regimen, often sleeping only a few hours a night, surviving on weak coffee and sheer willpower. His health, never robust, suffered under the strain, and the headaches and nervous episodes that would plague him throughout his life likely had their origins in these years of nocturnal study. Yet his mind thrived. He plunged into the works of the Scottish Enlightenment, moral philosophy, Hebrew, and political theory. The quiet of the library and his own dormitory room became his sanctuary, a place where the abstract ideals of justice and governance took tangible form in the pages of his books. President Witherspoon's influence cannot be overstated. He taught Madison not just what to think, but how to think, critically, logically, and with a deep sense of moral purpose applied to public life. Witherspoon's lectures on moral philosophy argued that liberty was a divine gift, but its preservation was a human responsibility requiring virtue, knowledge, and carefully constructed institutions. This fusion of Calvinist duty and Enlightenment rationality became the bedrock of Madison's political thought. Outside the classroom, the campus buzzed with debate. Students formed literary societies, like the American Whig Society, which Madison joined, where they practiced oratory and debated the pressing issues of the day, the nature of sovereignty, the rights of colonists, and the abuses of distant power. It was in these collegiate debates that Madison, who possessed a quiet voice unsuited for booming oratory, learned the power of preparation and penetrating argument. He wrote countless essays and speeches, honing a style that was dense, precise, and logically formidable. He observed that the loudest voice did not always win the day. Often, it was the best reasoned, most thoroughly researched argument that carried the room. This lesson in the power of quiet, persistent intellect over flamboyant passion shaped his entire career. Princeton was also a social leveler. For the first time, Madison lived in close quarters with young men from New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Caribbean. This exposure to different accents, attitudes, and economic perspectives was a miniature lesson in American diversity, teaching him that his beloved Virginia was but one part of a complex colonial tapestry. His dedication bore fruit when he completed his bachelor's degree in just 2 years. However, rather than return immediately to Virginia, he stayed on in Princeton for another 6 months of private study under Witherspoon's guidance, delving even deeper into theology and law. This postgraduate period was a time of intellectual synthesis, where the scattered threads of philosophy, history, and ethics began to weave together into a coherent worldview. The quiet halls of Princeton were, in reality, echoing with the coming storm of revolution. In 1770, students protested the Townshend Acts by burning candles in their windows in solidarity with Boston merchants. Madison was immersed in an atmosphere where academic discourse and political resistance were inseparable. Physically drained but intellectually supercharged, Madison finally returned to Montpelier in the spring of 1772. He left New Jersey not with a specific career in mind, but with a transformed consciousness. He was no longer simply a Virginia planter's son. He was a philosopher-citizen, armed with a formidable education and a profound conviction that governments existed to protect the natural rights of man. The shy student had found his voice on paper and his purpose in principle. The headaches and frail constitution were a price he seemed willing to pay for the luminous clarity he had gained. As he journeyed home, the peaceful Virginia countryside now framed itself against a new backdrop, the grand, uncertain experiment of self-governance. Princeton had given him the tools, and the coming revolution would soon present the workshop. The summer of 1787 in Philadelphia was a season of stifling heat, closed windows, and momentous secrecy. Into this charged atmosphere stepped James Madison, now 36, having arrived 11 days early with a portfolio of ideas as meticulously prepared as a military campaign. While others saw a convention to revise the failing Articles of Confederation, Madison envisioned a chance to start anew. He took a room at Mrs. Mary House's boarding establishment, a short walk from the Pennsylvania State House, and turned it into a command post. His early arrival was strategic. It allowed him to dine with key delegates, to listen, to persuade, and to finalize the plan he had been developing for months through letters and study. He brought with him a crate of books on republics, ancient and modern, sent by his friend Thomas Jefferson from Paris, but his true blueprint was in his mind, a vision of an extended republic with a strong national government, a vision born from his study of history and his frustrating experience in the impotent Continental Congress. When the delegates finally gathered in the East Room of the State House, with George Washington presiding in solemn dignity, Madison chose a seat directly in front of the president. From this vantage point, he could see every speaker and, crucially, ensure he could hear every word despite his soft voice. More importantly, he became the convention's most diligent scribe. Day after day, through hours of exhausting debate, he transcribed the proceedings in a unique shorthand of his own invention, creating the most complete record we have of those closed-door sessions. The ink on his pages captured the birth pangs of a nation, the soaring rhetoric, the petty grievances, the philosophical clashes, and the gritty political compromises. The windows were kept shut and the streets covered with mulch to deter eavesdroppers, locking the delegates in a sweltering intellectual pressure cooker where the fate of the Union was slowly forged. Madison's Virginia Plan, presented by the esteemed Edmund Randolph, became the conference's first working document and the catalyst for all that followed. It was a radical proposal, calling for a completely new national government with 3 independent branches and a legislature with representation based on population. This immediately set the stage for the great conflict of the convention, large states versus small states. For weeks, the debate raged. Madison, while a forceful advocate for proportional representation, was not a domineering speaker. His power lay in his relentless logic, his deep historical knowledge, and his ability to work behind the scenes. He understood that perfect ideas must often bend to the art of the possible. The grueling negotiation produced the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature with a proportional House and an equal state Senate, a solution Madison initially opposed but later accepted as the necessary glue to hold the convention together. Beyond the large state/small state rift, Madison played a pivotal role in countless other debates. He argued passionately for a national veto over state laws, a measure meant to prevent the kind of populist injustice he deeply feared, but this proved too strong for the states' rights-minded delegates. He engaged in the tortured discussions on slavery, that glaring contradiction to the convention's stated principles. Madison himself found the institution morally repugnant, yet, as a practical politician and a son of Virginia, He acquiesced to the compromises that protected it. The 3/5 clause for representation and the extension of the slave trade for 20 years. These were moments where the philosopher yielded to the pragmatist, where the ideal architecture was forced to incorporate flawed, existing foundations. As the summer wore on into September, Madison's energy was instrumental in pushing the weary delegates toward a conclusion. When the final document was ready for signing, he was exhausted but satisfied. The Constitution was not his Virginia plan in pure form. It was a patchwork of ideals, compromises, and practical necessities. Yet, its core framework, the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the creation of a supreme national authority, bore the unmistakable imprint of his mind. He signed it, knowing the battle was only half won. The next phase would require him to step out of the quiet committee room and into the public arena to defend the document in print, most famously in the Federalist Papers co-authored with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. And in the brutal ratification fight in his own Virginia. The architect now had to become the salesman and the defender, tasks for which his Philadelphia summer had prepared him more than he could have known. The new government under the Constitution began its work in the spring of 1789, and James Madison, now a congressman from Virginia, faced a formidable political challenge. During the ratification debates, a powerful argument against the Constitution had been its lack of a Declaration of Rights. Promises had been made that amendments would be considered in the first Congress to appease the anti-federalists and skeptical states like Virginia and New York. Initially, Madison saw a Bill of Rights as unnecessary. The federal government, he argued, had only enumerated powers, so it could not violate rights it wasn't given authority to touch. But he was a shrewd politician. He understood that to build national unity and legitimacy, and to honor the promise made during ratification, this gesture was essential. Furthermore, his dear friend Thomas Jefferson, writing from Paris, had persuaded him that a formal declaration would serve as a vital legal and moral touchstone for the people and the courts. Thus, in the busy first session of the House of Representatives, held in New York City, Madison took up the task. He did not do so lightly. He spent weeks sifting through the hundreds of amendments proposed by the state ratifying conventions, as well as existing state declarations of rights, particularly Virginia's, which had been drafted by George Mason. His goal was not to overhaul the structure of the new government, but to insert specific, actionable protections for individual liberties into its framework. On June 8, 1789, he stood before the House and introduced a list of proposed amendments. His speech was a masterclass in pragmatic statesmanship, framing the Bill of Rights not as a concession to critics, but as a unifying project that would kill the opposition and bring in those who were hostile to the new system. The proposals he laid out were numerous and broad. They included protections for freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. They guaranteed the right to bear arms, protected against the quartering of soldiers, and secured citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. They outlined rights for the accused in criminal trials, including due process, trial by jury, and protection against self-incrimination. They also included what would become the 9th and 10th Amendments, addressing the concern that listing some rights might imply the government had power over unlisted ones, and reaffirming that powers not delegated to the federal government were reserved to the states or the people. The scope was breathtaking, a deliberate attempt to create a comprehensive shield for the individual against potential governmental overreach. The process that followed was one of meticulous distillation. The House formed a committee to review Madison's proposals, and the debate was lengthy. Some Federalists thought it a waste of time, some anti-Federalists thought it didn't go far enough to curtail federal power. Madison served as the persistent floor manager, shepherding each clause through debate, modification, and vote. Through this legislative grinding mill, his original list of over 20 amendments was refined, combined, and ultimately whittled down to 17 that the House sent to the Senate. The Senate, meeting in secret session, made further changes, consolidating the list to 12 amendments. Notably, the Senate rejected Madison's attempt to apply the protections of free speech, conscience, and jury trials against state governments, a limitation that would stand until the 20th century. In the end, a conference committee reconciled the House and Senate versions, and on September 25, 1789, Congress approved 12 amendments to be sent to the states for ratification. The journey was not yet over. Madison, now performing the dual role of author and lobbyist, worked to ensure ratification in the states. He wrote letters, leveraged his networks, and patiently waited. The first two proposed amendments, concerning congressional apportionment and congressional pay, failed to garner enough state support. But the remaining 10 found favor, weaving their way into the consciousness of the nation. On December 15, 1791, with Virginia's ratification, the Bill of Rights officially became part of the supreme law of the land. For Madison, this work was perhaps his most directly enduring legacy to the American people. The grand architecture of the Constitution established the machinery of government, but the Bill of Rights gave that machinery its soul and its limits. It translated the abstract blessings of liberty promised in the preamble into concrete, legal protections for every citizen. In crafting these amendments, Madison demonstrated that his genius lay not only in designing systems of power, but also in defining the sacred spaces where power must stop. The quiet, determined congressman had ensured that the revolutionary promise of individual freedom was codified into the foundation of the Republic, creating a living document that would continue to breathe and expand for centuries to come. When James and Dolly Madison moved into the president's house in March 1809, Washington City was still a raw, muddy capital, more promise than polished reality. The mansion itself, rebuilt after the British torched it in 1814 during the war that would define Madison's presidency, stood as a stark symbol of both the nation's fragility and its resilience. For the Madisons, this building was not just an official residence, but a center of national life during a time of profound crisis. Dolly, with her renowned social grace, transformed its cavernous rooms into spaces of warmth and political connection, famously saving Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington from the flames as the British approached. James, burdened by the weight of an unpopular war, found within those walls little respite from the pressures of office, yet together they established a tone of Republican simplicity mixed with necessary diplomacy. The War of 1812 cast a long shadow over Madison's time in the Executive Mansion. The house was often a command center filled with anxious cabinet secretaries, military couriers, and the grim tidings of battlefield setbacks. Madison, a man of intellect and deliberation, was thrust into the role of a war president, a part that did not suit his temperament. The sounds of construction, carpenters and stonemasons repairing the fire-blackened walls after 1815 provided a daily soundtrack of national rebirth parallel to his administrative efforts to rebuild the country's finances and pride. The Treaty of Ghent, ending the war, was signed in December 1814, but news traveled slowly. The grand victory at New Orleans, fought after the peace was sealed, occurred in January 1815, finally allowing a sense of relief to permeate the presidential rooms. Day-to-day life in the house followed a gentle rhythm when state affairs allowed. Madison was an early riser, often taking a morning ride to review his health and his thoughts. Breakfasts were simple, and he spent long hours in his study, a room lined with books, attending to correspondence and policy. His slight stature and quiet demeanor were a contrast to the power of his office. Dolly managed the household with aplomb, hosting her legendary Wednesday night drawing rooms. These events were masterpieces of political theater, where Federalists and Republicans, diplomats and senators, could mingle informally. Dolly's charm and her husband's quiet conversations in the corner did more to ease partisan tensions than many formal proclamations. The president's house under the Madisons became, for the first time, the true social heart of the capital. The physical discomforts of the early White House were manifold. The building was damp and cold in winter, difficult to heat with its large, high-ceilinged rooms. In summer, it was sweltering, vulnerable to the mosquitoes from the nearby Potomac Flats. The domestic staff, A mix of hired servants and enslaved people from Montpelier worked tirelessly to maintain a semblance of refined order amidst the chaos of construction and constant public scrutiny. Madison's personal manner as president within his home was consistently described as kind, gentle, and unpretentious. He was a host, not a monarch, embodying the Republican ideal that the people's servant lived in a house owned by the people, a concept still fresh and revolutionary in a world of palaces and courts. After the war, the mood within the residence shifted toward legacy and closure. The so-called era of good feelings began to dawn during Madison's final years in office, a period of declining partisan strife that his administration helped usher in. In the rebuilt Oval Drawing Room, the future Blue Room, he would entertain heroes of the war like Andrew Jackson, reconciling with political opponents and setting the stage for a peaceful transition. His last annual message to Congress, delivered in December 1816, reflected on a nation now secure in its sovereignty, its economy turning from war to internal development. As he and Dolly prepared to leave Washington in the spring of 1817, returning the house to his successor James Monroe, they left behind a residence that had been tested by war and fire and had emerged as an enduring symbol. They had personally guided it from a burnt shell to a renewed home for the presidency, mirroring their own role in guiding the nation through its second war of independence and into a new era of confident self-determination. The journey home to Montpelier in the spring of 1817 was a journey back to the source. After nearly 40 years of relentless public service, as Congressman, Secretary of State, and President, James Madison, now 65, and his beloved Dolly returned to the orange brick mansion on the Virginia Piedmont. The estate had been managed in their long absence by family and overseers, and it required their full attention. This was not a retreat into idle leisure, but an active, engaged retirement. Madison referred to himself as a farmer of Montpelier, and he took the title seriously, plunging into the daily management of the 5,000-acre plantation with the same meticulous attention he once gave to constitutional clauses. His study, with its panoramic view of the Blue Ridge Mountains, became once again the center of his world, now filled not with state papers, but with agricultural journals, account ledgers, and correspondence with fellow scientific farmers like Thomas Jefferson. These were indeed golden years for the Madisons as a couple. Freed from the fishbowl of Washington politics, they enjoyed a deep and companionable marriage. Dolly's social magic transformed Montpelier into a mecca for visitors. A steady stream of family, old friends, admirers, and the simply curious made the pilgrimage to the home of the last surviving founding father. The house was constantly filled with conversation, the clink of teacups, and the laughter of Dolly's nieces and nephews, whom they often hosted. On the portico overlooking the lawn, Madison, ever the gracious host, would engage guests in thoughtful discussion, his voice still soft, his mind as sharp as ever. For many visitors, an audience with the father of the Constitution was a profound experience, a living link to the nation's creation. Madison's agricultural pursuits were both practical and experimental. He sought to make Montpelier profitable and sustainable, wrestling with the exhausted soils of Virginia that had been depleted by decades of tobacco farming. He diversified crops, shifting toward wheat and corn, practiced crop rotation, and experimented with fertilizers and animal husbandry. He was a passionate advocate for agricultural science, seeing in improved farming methods not just personal gain, but a national necessity. He served as the president of the Albemarle Agricultural Society, sharing his findings and learning from others. Yet, despite his innovations, the plantation economy, reliant on the labor of over 100 enslaved people, proved increasingly unprofitable. The moral and economic paradox of slavery, which he intellectually condemned, remained the inescapable foundation of his domestic peace and economic survival. Intellectually, his retirement was anything but quiet. He embarked on a monumental project, the careful editing and preparation of his notes from the 1787 Constitutional Convention for posthumous publication. For hours each day, he would decipher his own shorthand, clarifying points, ensuring accuracy, knowing this record would be his final and most definitive gift to history. He maintained a vast correspondence, debating contemporary issues like the Missouri Compromise and the nullification crisis with Jefferson, Monroe, and others. His letters from this period are a treasure trove of reflective wisdom, warning against the dangers of secession and passionately defending the Union he had helped create. He also took a leading role in founding the University of Virginia, following Jefferson's lead, serving as a rector after Jefferson's death and helping to shape its curriculum, ensuring the next generation would be educated in the principles of Republican government. Life at Montpelier followed a serene and purposeful rhythm. Mornings were for correspondence and study in his library. Afternoons might involve a ride across the plantation to inspect fields or livestock. Evenings were for family and guests. As the years passed, Madison's health gradually declined. The bilious attacks and rheumatism that had plagued him for decades became more frequent. Yet, his spirit remained engaged with the world. He oversaw a major expansion of the mansion, doubling its size to accommodate the constant flow of visitors and to reflect Dolly's love of entertaining. The landscape itself was his pride. He designed the winding walkways, planted groves of trees, and shaped the grounds to create a harmonious blend of natural beauty and cultivated order. For Madison, managing his land was another form of governance, a smaller-scale practice of the order and balance he had sought to instill in the nation. These years were a full-circle return, a chance to apply his enlightened principles to the very soil from which he had sprung, surrounded by the love of his wife and the respect of a nation that increasingly viewed him as a sacred oracle of the founding era. The final years at Montpelier were marked by the gentle, inevitable fading of twilight. James Madison, the last of the great founding fathers to pass from the scene, became a living monument, a repository of wisdom from a revolutionary age that was rapidly receding into history. His world grew smaller, contracting from the broad fields of his plantation to the rooms of his mansion, and finally to the chair by his study window. Frail and often confined by debilitating rheumatism, his mind remained a clear, bright flame, burning with concern for the republic he had midwifed. The crises of the 1830s, particularly the nullification crisis championed by John C. Calhoun, filled him with profound dread. He saw in the doctrine of state nullification a poison that could dissolve the Union, and he spent immense energy in his final years writing letters and a public advice to my country, forcefully rejecting it and reaffirming the Constitution as the work of the whole people, not a compact of sovereign states. His daily life became a ritual of quiet endurance and intellectual labor. He was meticulously arranging his papers, especially his convention notes, for history. The task was immense, a race against time and failing eyesight. He knew these documents were not merely personal property, but national patrimony, the secret history of the Constitution's creation. He dictated letters and essays, his voice weak but his arguments ironclad. Visitors still came, but now they were received as pilgrims paying homage. Young politicians, historians, and ordinary citizens would be ushered into his presence, where they found a small, wizened man wrapped in blankets, who would offer them penetrating insights in a whisper. These encounters were profoundly moving, a direct transmission of the founding spirit. Dolly was his constant and devoted companion, his eyes and hands when his own failed, the vigilant guardian of his comfort and peace. Their bond, which had been the great joy of his retirement, deepened into a silent, steadfast partnership against the encroaching shadows. The financial troubles that would later plague Dolly were already looming, as the plantation system faltered and debts mounted, but Madison, ever the optimist about the nation if not his own finances, likely shielded her from the full gravity of their situation. His primary concern was for her future well-being and the preservation of his life's work in writing. As the spring of 1836 arrived, his strength ebbed steadily. He took to his bed, surrounded by the books and papers that had been the tools of his life's vocation. His final illness was prolonged, but he faced it with the calm rationality that had defined his character. Ever the systematic thinker, he gave instructions about his burial and his papers. In his last days, his thoughts reportedly turned not to fear, but to his friends, his wife, and the enduring hope for the Union. On the morning of June 28, 1836, exactly 5 years to the day after the passing of his friend and collaborator Thomas Jefferson, James Madison quietly died at Montpelier. He was 85 years old. The cause was heart failure, but it was as if the last ember of the founding generation had simply, and finally, flickered out. His passing was met with national mourning. Eulogies celebrated him not as a warrior or a dynamic orator, but as the father of the Constitution, the master builder whose quiet intellect had designed the framework for American liberty. His legacy, however, was not left to words alone. It was embedded in the very fabric of the government. The system of checks and balances, the enumerated powers, the protection of minority rights within a majority system, and the first 10 amendments, these were his living monuments, more enduring than marble. He had demonstrated that profound power could reside in quiet study, reasoned argument, and principled compromise. In the years immediately following his death, Montpelier entered a period of struggle and decline under the weight of debt, eventually passing out of the family. Yet, Madison's philosophical legacy only grew. Later generations, grappling with the meanings of federalism, liberty, and union, would constantly return to his words in the Federalist Papers, his convention notes, and his letters. He had provided the operating manual for the American experiment. The quiet legacy of James Madison is thus a paradox. It is the immense, roaring success of a nation built largely upon the blueprints drafted by a soft-spoken, thoughtful man who believed that the most powerful force in politics was not passion, but reason carefully inscribed and institutionally enshrined. His twilight at Montpelier was not an end, but a transition, as his ideas took on a life of their own, guiding the Republic forward on the path he had so carefully charted through the uncertain terrain of human nature and self-government.